This was around the time the United States began full-scale intervention in the Korean War. The North Korean Army, which was advancing south, attempted to force its way across the Han River before U.S. Army reinforcements could arrive. North Korean troops quickly repaired bridges that had not yet been destroyed, made them large enough for tanks to cross, and began crossing the Han River, then invaded the south side. In response, the South Korean military retreated to buy time for a counterattack. In this way, the North Korean Army, which continued to advance south, and the American ground forces dispatched to South Korea clashed. At first, people thought that the situation would immediately turn around if the U.S. military entered the war. The advance party's military force was not strong enough to stop the North Korean Army. In response to this situation, the United States was forced to send troops stationed in Japan to the Korean peninsula one after another. The United Nations forces was created to respond to this war. Douglas MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations forces and established the United Nations Forces Command. President Syngman Rhee sent a letter to Douglas MacArthur. Syngman Rhee told Douglas MacArthur, "Our cooperation is necessary to win the war, so as a temporary measure, I will entrust you with command of the Korean military." Douglas MacArthur agreed, and the Korean military came under the command of the United Nations forces. The Korean War was fought under the leadership of the United Nations forces led by the United States. The North Korean military thought, "We must settle this before the United Nations forces begin to move in earnest." The North Korean army decided that this was a race against time and sent reserve forces to the front lines, further increasing the speed of their advance. As a result, the United Nations forces were pushed back to the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. Just 3 months after the outbreak of the war, North Korean forces seized control of approximately 90% of the Korean peninsula. The situation at the time was one of a race against time, with the North Korean army competing to see how quickly it could occupy Busan or how quickly United Nations forces reinforcements could arrive. The United Nations forces insisted, as the race against time continued, "We will not withdraw from Korea. There is no Dunkirk in Korea. If you lose even an inch of Korea, you will lose many of your comrades in arms." The United Nations forces continued to defend themselves desperately, with a firm determination to fight to the end. An estimated 700,000 to 800,000 refugees had crowded into this small area. It was an extremely difficult situation, with food, clothing and shelter all at stake. The North Korean army considered this small area to be the site of the final battle and launched multiple attacks. The United Nations forces decided that if this place fell, they would lose Korea, and continued to send supplies to Busan while holding out in a dangerous situation. The North Korean military's usual strategy was to concentrate its forces at one point between Daegu and Busan in order to separate them and attempt a breakthrough. But the big problem here was air superiority. Air superiority remained with the United Nations forces, so concentrating forces on a particular breach point could expose them to heavy bombardment by United Nations forces aircraft. The North Korean army was unable to focus its attacks on one area, but continued to attack on all fronts. However, as the supply ships continued to move south, they were unable to keep up with supplies and replenish troops, and the North Korean military's fighting strength gradually depleted. On the map, it appears that North Korean forces are cornering United Nations forces. However, in reality, the North Korean military had already reached the limits of its military strength and was in a difficult position to maintain. The race against time that ensued in this situation ultimately resulted in United Nations forces reinforcements arriving first. This is where Douglas MacArthur took action. From the moment Douglas MacArthur sent ground troops into South Korea, he had a plan to land new troops behind the North Korean army and surround it with a pincer attack. To realize Douglas MacArthur's plan, a landing point had to be secured behind the North Korean forces. Douglas MacArthur focused on Incheon. Douglas MacArthur's plan was to first land a landing force at Incheon and then advance east to retake Seoul. The follow-up troops followed behind them and advanced south. The subsequent forces were to cooperate with the United Nations forces counterattacking in the Busan area and surround and annihilate the main force of the North Korean army. The problem here was Incheon's topography. To land at Incheon, they had to approach land through a narrow sea channel. Much of Incheon's coastline consisted of tidal flats, creating extremely unfavorable conditions for a landing. The most suitable period for landing in Incheon was during high tide during spring tides, which only occurred 2 to 3 days a month. The time period was very short. Within the U.S. military, there were many pessimistic opinions that this operation will be difficult to carry out. Douglas MacArthur insisted that the very impossibility of carrying out a surprise attack demonstrates its great effectiveness, and refused to back down from his plan. Douglas MacArthur succeeded in persuading those around him, and the United Nations forces, led by the U.S. military, mobilized 261 ships and approximately 75,000 troops and began landing behind the North Korean forces. This was the Incheon landing operation. The United Nations forces loaded troops and tanks onto ships and began landing towards Incheon. At that time, the North Korean military was committing almost all of its forces to the capture of Busan, so many inadequately trained troops were stationed in rear areas, including Seoul. The sweep of North Korean forces around Incheon went smoothly. However, after a while the tide began to go out and the boat was forced to leave land. The next high tide is in about 10 hours. The troops that had landed earlier were temporarily left behind on land. The United Nations forces launched planes from aircraft carrier to attack North Korean forces to prevent them from gathering in Incheon. While the landing forces were held off by air support, additional landings of the main force were made from both north and south of Incheon at the second high tide. The North Korean army, which was responsible for rearguard duties, was unable to cope with the United Nations forces landing one after another, and the United Nations forces were able to firmly establish a foothold. After the landing, the United Nations forces began their advance eastward. In order to prevent this, the North Korean military attempted to pincer the United Nations forces from both the south and the north. The closer they got to Seoul, the stronger the North Korean resistance became. However, the United Nations forces continued their advance and recaptured Seoul. As the landing operation at Incheon progressed, the United Nations forces in the Busan area responded by going on the offensive. Initially, the North Korean troops on the front lines had not received any information that United Nations forces had landed in Incheon, so they continued to defend their positions as usual. However, with their supply lines to the rear cut off, the North Korean army gradually became more impatient. Kim Il-sung ordered a gradual withdrawal. However, as a result of the withdrawal, the North Korean army lost its fighting strength, making it difficult to maintain its front line. As the North Korean army began to collapse, the United Nations forces immediately began their pursuit. The North Korean army could not withstand this pursuit, and soon the front line collapsed. Kim Il-sung ordered the withdrawal of all troops, and the tide of the war quickly turned in favor of the United Nations forces. However, as United Nations forces pushed the North Korean forces back to the 38th parallel, new problems arose. The United Nations had originally adopted a resolution stating that the North Korean forces will be repelled north of the 38th parallel, and that United Nations forces will be sent to that end. And the United Nations forces achieved this goal. However, the United Nations had not yet established a clear policy on what to do next. From here on, there were two main options. The first option is to cross the 38th parallel and aim for the unification of Korea. The second option is to stop the military at the 38th parallel and seek a political solution. There was also disagreement within the United States about which option to choose. This is an argument in favor of the former. The United Nations forces are on the offensive. It's hard to stop moving forward here. If the United Nations forces stop, the 38th parallel could become a permanent border. The claim was that North Korean forces may attack again. This is an argument in favor of the latter. But if they cross the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union and China could intervene. The claim was that it could develop into World War III. Douglas MacArthur was a major influence in this conflict of opinion. Douglas MacArthur believed that the annihilation of the North Korean army is the top priority. To achieve this, we have no choice but to cross the 38th parallel. It is unlikely that the Soviet Union or China will intervene. As these opinions grew stronger, the United States solidified its position in favor of advancing north. By this time, the Soviet Union had returned to the United Nations Security Council. Any new resolution against North Korea would likely be blocked by a Soviet veto power. The United States chose to raise the issue of Korea at the UN General Assembly rather than at the Security Council. Here too, the discussion was difficult. The UN General Assembly ultimately passed a resolution supporting the unification, independence and establishment of a democratic government for Korea. Douglas MacArthur responded by urging Kim Il-sung to surrender, but Kim did not respond. The United Nations forces then crossed the 38th parallel and began their advance into North Korean territory.